Hello, and welcome to Life as a Scale Model. I appreciate you stopping by the channel. I would appreciate it more if you would take your time to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps us out and bringing you more ambitious projects and doing cool things in the future. Thank you so much. Today, we're going to be starting on a rather cool build. We're going to be going all the way back to Star Trek's beginning with the original USS Enterprise. And this particular model kit, the 1/2500 scale Enterprise, is one of the first that Round 2 made back in the day, back when they were only AMT. And we have production issues to thank for the fact that we get Star Trek models these days, because way back in the 60s, when Star Trek was only in its very first season, they found themselves with a wee bit of a conundrum. They needed a prop for a shuttlecraft, and they couldn't afford it in the budget. So they approached AMT and cut a deal with AMT where AMT would design and cover the costs to build the shuttle prop they needed, and in return, AMT would get exclusive rights to make models based off of all of Star Trek's very cool ships. And so here, almost 60 years later, we are building models of all of Star Trek's really cool ships in 1/2500 scale. Now, this particular kit was released in 1988 with this 3 Enterprise set that you see in the picture. And that was kind of the start of, hey, let's make some somewhat easier models for less experienced modelers to build. They were pretty primitive by today's standards, but they were still pretty cool. You could put them together, they snapped pretty tight. You gave them a nice base coat color, maybe did some detail paint. The only decals they actually came with were the marking decals, so they were just very crude, very rudimentary. But in 2010, the company released the Cadet Series model kits. And these model kits were essentially the same, except that now they came with these wonderful wallpaper decals that we all bang our heads against. And you could include a whole lot more detail with them. You could get the Aztecing, and a lot of them included decals for some of the details that you normally had to paint, and they just, from a distance, looked a lot better. Those Cadet Series models were in production, I think, until about 2017, when AMT released this lineage set with all 7 of the Enterprises that existed at the time, and that was kind of a big deal amongst the modelers. But then we kind of tapered off. The only one that has been in continual production since has been the Enterprise D. We've had a few releases based on Star Trek Discovery in 2500, but up until fairly recently, things have just been pretty quiet. However, in May 2025, we are getting a new kit that comes with 4 of the Enterprises. It's vaguely reminiscent of the, I believe, first Cadet Series kit that came with the TOS Enterprise, the refit, and the Enterprise B. It will include all of those. In addition, it will also include the NX-01. So if you've been following along with this series and you want to get your hands on some of the upcoming builds, then AMT has you covered. This kit's going to be about $35 to $40 depending on where you buy it. And although I didn't intend a shameless plug for someone who's doing great things for the community, you can see from my picture the great prices. He's also got some other great Star Trek models you can pick up, so I would check out that website if you're looking to get this particular set. That said, I got a preview of this set, and I was a little disappointed because we're basically getting the same exact molds we've gotten since 1988. And I was kind of hoping they would update that. But you can see what we're working with here. We've got a few sprues. I'll explain why later. And then I've also got 2 decal sets. And again, I will explain why we're doing that later. To get started, though, we're just going to go ahead and jump into the saucer. Seems a relatively safe and easy place to start. So I'm just going to use my snippers and cut that saucer bottom off the sprue, and then carefully use my hobby knife to get some of the excess flash off. Because this is an older mold, we're going to probably run into a little bit more issues with flash on the model. And that's just a byproduct of the age of the molds they're using. But honestly, I don't recall encountering too much that gave me a headache. I gave myself headaches in other ways, as we will soon find out. I am going to take the time to kind of sand everything smooth a bit, simply because with this particular kit, it's a little easier to do some of that cleanup work as you go, as opposed to the NX models where I did everything after the fact. And the reason that is because unlike the NX models, the parts for this kit are not quite as integrated. You know, we're not sandwiching a deflector between halves of the saucer section, or sandwiching that warp nacelle boom assembly in between. I'm just pointing out there with my no-no that for some reason AMT put copyright markings on the inside of the upper saucer. If you're not planning on painting this particular model, that could be a bit of an issue. What they did do that makes life kind of nice is they did include little nubs on the top of the saucer that will help you to line the two halves up. They also included these raised lines, which I think are supposed to represent sensor equipment on the hull. They're no bueno. And I'm going to release my inner geek for a second and explain to you why. When we're working in scale, you've got two numbers. You've got the number that comes before the colon or the slash, and then you got the number that comes after. And the number that comes before is typically a 1. And the number that comes after will vary based on what scale the model is in this case 2500. So what that means is take any measurement unit that you would like, be it inches, feet, centimeters, meters, whatever. And what that fraction is telling us is that the model kit itself, if you measure, say, a millimeter on the kit, that will represent 2,500 millimeters on the object if we were able to measure it in real life. And so if you're crafty like I am, and you get out on the internet and you go to scale converters, you can work out some basic math wherein you can figure out just about how big those grid lines would be if they were on a real world version of the USS Enterprise. I measured them out. They're a little shy of a millimeter, but for the sake of making the point here, we'll just go with a millimeter because that makes the math easier. So they're roughly a millimeter, and if you run it through the scale calculator at 1/2500, the raised grid lines that they put on there eventually end up figuring out that they would be about 2 meters tall, 2.5 meters tall. And that's like 8 feet tall. And I visualized that in my mind and got a little chuckle at the idea of the beautiful TOS Enterprise gliding through space with these 8-foot rings around the bottom of its saucer. And so for that reason, I don't really like that approach to how AMT created these models, although I do understand why they began doing that. You know, as I pointed out with the original releases of these kits, they were fairly rudimentary. They just came with markings. And so to add a little bit of visual interest, I'm sure they decided, that was a quick and easy way to do that. We've just taken, my 60 grit, we sanded everything down, and then I just stepped down to uh, finer grits and got everything as smoothed out as I could. Now we're going to use those 3 pegs that were on the top of the saucer to line everything up, and we're going to see how well it fits together just by snapping. I'm also going to go ahead at this point and try to get the edges of each of the pieces as flush as I can. There's always going to be a little overhang, but just try to get things as smooth as you can get them. If you can't get it perfect, that's fine. But definitely try to even those out. It'll give your model a slightly more polished look by the time you get done. And I'm pretty happy with that. So now I'll peel it apart and I'll go ahead and glue those 2 pieces together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the glue on the bottom side, and I'm going to make sure in particular to get the glue in the holes where those pegs fit. And that'll ensure that I get a good solid bond between those pegs and those holes. And I'm just going to go around really lightly with my brush and put glue all the way around. And once I get done actually putting the pieces together, I've got 4 tiny little clamps off screen. I'm going to go ahead and clamp those together. I brought this up in the NX01 builds that I've done. Those snap together pieces, they tend to snap together fairly well. They're usually pretty tight fit, but any help we can give them is going to be good, just to make sure that we get a nice solid bond between those 2 pieces. And I actually did end up having to go back after the fact, and I found a little section of the saucer where the 2 halves hadn't joined together very well, so I just used my brush and tried to get a little glue in between them, and then took one of those clamps and clamped it back down to make sure that the seam was nice and tight all the way around. And now that we got that done, we can go ahead and get started on the next bit. And as I said, it's a little easier with this kit to kind of clean things up as you go along. If you've got to get your leftover sprue connections filed down or whatever, take care of that beforehand. Or if you've got uneven seams, take care of that beforehand. We will do filling after we get everything else put together, but the basic stuff we're going to go ahead and take care of. We're not going to start with the engineering hole, as you might think, and the reason being the warp nacelle pylons actually sandwich in between those 2 pieces. And so if you were to pull the engineering section pieces apart or off the sprue and put them together, you would not be able to put the warp nacelle pylons on there. So if you're building this one, just be mindful of that. It will tell you in the instructions usually, although I can't vouch for what the instructions are going to look like with this new set coming out in May. If they're anything like the instructions we got with the Allies and Adversaries set, they'll have a really, really oversimplified pictogram showing you how everything is supposed to go. And so just pay really close attention to what they're trying to communicate with that if you're building that particular version of the kit. The older versions that come out of the Lineage set or one of those Cadet Series sets, those have much more in-depth instructions for you to follow. So all I'm doing here is I'm trying to sand down some some flash lines that were on the fronts and the backs of the pylons. There's also some raised quote-unquote detail that was molded into it, and this is what I'm talking about. If Round 2 is watching, or if AMT is watching this, please update this kit, because you've got this raised detail that originally was supposed to represent some dark panels that appear on the inside of the warp nacelle pylons. And if you were building this back in the 80s or 90s, those would be great because they would show you where you would want to paint those rectangular details onto the pylons. However, now that we've got these great decals that have been coming out since the Cadet series started, we don't need to paint those details because they give you decals you can lay down to do that. So really, all that raised detail does at this point is get in the way and potentially make a more difficult task out of applying what are already some pretty finicky decals. So as I go along, you're going to notice me sanding off a lot of stuff off the surfaces of these model kits, and that's the reason why. I just feel like the raised panel lines get in the way. It makes it a little bit more difficult to lay down those decals flat against the model. And when you finally do get it put together, they actually do kind of take away from the look of the model, in my opinion. So yeah, easy fix, just sand them down. You can see this one may be a little bit tougher to get at than others. It's kind of a balance between putting enough pressure to actually sand things, which you don't need much, but these are, spindly little pylons. So if you overdo it too much, it is definitely possible to break them. So bear that in mind as you're doing this, if you're going to, go ahead and sand these things down, because you don't want to break your model. I mean, unless you do. There's no right or wrong way to build a model, and as I demonstrated with the NX refit, sometimes you got to break it before you can make it. Now I'm sanding off panel lines on the outside of the nacelle pylons that I believe are supposed to represent some windows. I would need to check my Haynes manual to see if I'm remembering that correctly, or if you happen to know off the top of your head, throw it in the comments below, because I totally spaced checking that detail before I started recording the audio for the video. But I do believe they're supposed to represent a few windows that appear on the outsides of the nacelle pylons. But yeah, we're just going to take those off too. In my recollection, I don't remember ever seeing windows on the nacelle pylons. That doesn't mean they don't exist, and that's why I go to great lengths and efforts to amass as much reference material as I can, so that I don't have to trust my faulty memory when it comes to remembering what details do and do not appear on the model. Now I'm doing the inside of the other nacelle pylon, and I'm just checking with my thumbs to make sure they're good and smooth, and I'm going to give that my stamp of approval, because perfection is the enemy of progress. Now you'll see that half of the engineering hull just kind of fell out because it wasn't connected with its secondary sprue connection. And again, that's because this is just a really old kit that, again, if AMT is listening, is in dire need of retooling. So I'm just getting that one sprue connection sanded down. Now I'll cut out the other part. And if you're going to sand down the details that they molded into the surface of the model kit, I'm about to show you what's going to be your absolute worst enemy here in just a sec. We'll get the excess sprue off of this with my hobby knife, and then uh, I will show you what will be your momentary bane of existence. It might be difficult to see, but there are a bunch of windows molded into the side of the engineering hull and the neck. We don't like those. For one, we already explained that at scale, the frames for those windows would be 8 feet long, like 8 feet tall. That's ridiculous, guys. But also, those windows are really, really big. If you look at pictures of the original Enterprise, yes, there are windows on the sides of the engineering hull and the side of the neck, but they are not nearly that big. And I'm sure the intention originally was to give modelers a confined space where they could paint those windows on without having to worry about them not being rectangular. You've got this convenient rectangular area that is enclosed, and you can, paint right inside the lines and get some windows. They might look comically huge against the side of the ship, but they could at least exist. Now we've got wonderful decals that we can apply that will do all the heavy lifting in recreating that detail for us. So once again, here I am sanding. I would like to point out that the TOS Enterprise is not the biggest offender when it comes to panel lines and grid lines. We will definitely be discussing this particular point of conversation again later in a lot more frustrated detail. I do believe, though, that this is a pretty good kit for somebody who's just getting started on these kinds of models. And one of the reasons that I think that is because this ship was designed in the 60s and it was used on television in the 60s when, resolution was, I don't know, terrible. If you were alive in the 60s and watching this on TV and you can remember, please let me know what the resolution looked like back in the 60s. But I imagine terrible, especially by today's standards of, 4K and 1080. But because the resolution wasn't so great, the model builders didn't really have to include a lot of detail on the ship. It's not like today where we might expect to get these gratuitous beauty shots that are super up close and personal and you're getting all your starship love. No, they couldn't do that. They didn't really have the time or the budget and possibly not the technology to do that. So, as is pretty well known within the Star Trek community, they did a few generic passes filming the Enterprise model, and they just reused those shots over and over and over unless the episode called for something specific. And as a result, unlike some of the other model kits, you don't have all of these wallpaper decals that you have to put all over the entire ship. Like every surface of the ship is going to be covered in decals. It's not that way. And so if you can get past the panel lines and some of the fitment issues, in terms of decaling, this is actually a fairly easy ship to build. And so it's one that I might recommend, despite its age, for people who are just trying to jump into 2500 scale starship modeling. Because you're not going to have to deal with the headaches of trying to wrap a wallpaper decal around a complex contour or something like that. You're just going to have a very straightforward experience. So I'm trying to get little nooks and crannies. Unfortunately, the panel lines for the windows on the neck do run into the engineering hull. So it can be kind of hard to get into that crook of the crook of the neck and the engineering hull, as it were. And now I'm going to dry fit the pylons. One thing I've had problems with in the past with this particular kit is the section of hull between the two pylons on that particular piece that forms that hump tends to sit kind of high. So I'm just experimenting here to see if I can maybe glue it in place before I put the engineering hull together and have it sit lower in the model. I'm also trying to figure out, which direction is going to be best for giving me the best alignment. I would ideally like these pylons to be as straight and as well aligned as I can get them. It is, though, a nearly 40-year-old kit, and so perfection may not be possible. Don't let that discourage you or slow you down. Just get it to where you're as happy with it as you think you're ever going to get, and say, well, that's close enough, and then move on. You will see that I kind of had to do that here because reasons, and I will explain them when we get there. But don't dwell on perfection. Like I said, perfection is the enemy of progress, and if there's one thing we're all about here at Life as a Scale Model, it's forging ahead, trying to make progress and trying to learn from our mistakes as we go, and then we take another crack at it later. I'm going kind of heavy on the glue here. That was a choice. I stand by it. Now we're just going to carefully take the other half of that engineering hull and line it up so the pegs meet the holes, and squish. Just going to smush it together. Do some smush. Now you can probably see, it's not quite as noticeable from this angle, but you can probably already tell. Those nacelles look like they're swept backwards just a tiny bit. I thought about trying to finagle them so that they would be a little bit more straight and perpendicular to the long axis of the ship, but there just wasn't enough room for me to really move them in that particular way. So now I'm just trying to see how they align with the vertical axis. And now I'm going to move on because there's not a whole lot I could do about that situation. I'm going to move on and start on the warp nacelles themselves. I do like the way that these were engineered, because you've got the two halves of the nacelles, and then you've got the end cap that you put on later that kind of acts as a mechanism to hold them all together. So it was a good design for the time. I'm not sure what round 2 would do in 2025 if they were to redesign it, but for 1988 it was a pretty good setup. But speaking of fitment issues, there's one that you definitely want to be aware of going into this kit if you're going to build it. There's a little cylindrical part of the nacelle that's not supposed to be seen. It's just the attachment point for the end cap, and that attachment point tends to be a little bit too long for the end cap to fit flush against the rest of the nacelles. So, get your nacelles all cleaned up like I'm doing here, sand down and file down your seam lines and whatnot, get them glued together, and then once you have them glued together, if you want those end caps to fit as well as they can, just take a nice heavy piece of sandpaper. I recommend 60 grit. That's just kind of my go-to. And sand that little cylindrical attachment piece that's at the very end of them. And, just sand it so it's not quite so long. And that'll ensure that you get a nice good fit with that nacelle end cap. I took my I took my um, clamps off of my saucer in anticipation of using them on my nacelle. However, my clamps have plastic business ends, and so what ended up happening was I put a clamp on and it just slid right off. I may rectify that in the future. For the time being, I decided, I can just hold these together. The model glue that I was using, it sets pretty quick, and then it cures usually within about 2 or 3 hours. But once it sets, which only usually takes about 90 seconds or so, and then as long as you've got a pretty good bond and you've got a pretty decent amount of contact area, it typically works pretty well and lets you do what you need to do. It also sticks to your thumbs. So here we go. We're gonna try that. And it's just nope, not gonna do it. It also sticks to your thumbs. You see me wiping there. It's because I got thumbprints on the surface of the nacelle from the glue. It was on my thumb. I touched the nacelle, and we've got a mess that we've got to sand down. I've just come to accept that as part of the process. But do try to be as clean as possible. Try not to get anything on your hands. One of the worst things you can experience is putting all the time and effort into building a model and trying to make it look as amazing as you can possibly get it, only to realize after everything is all said and done that you had some glue on one of your fingers or on your thumb, and you touched the model and it left one of your fingerprints on the model. So be conscientious, be a little more meticulous when it comes to how you put that stuff together, all the model pieces and whatnot, so that you don't end up with phantom fingerprints all over your model kits. It can be a little harder to accomplish with these tiny kits just because things are tiny. But do your best. You're going to notice here that I did not take my own advice when it came to that little cylindrical contact area on the end of that warp nacelle. And in fact, I ended up having to go back and pry that end cap off and do the thing that I previously mentioned that you do, which was to sand down that little cylindrical area and then reapply the nacelle. I was smart enough to, try to make sure that round was round, which is an issue with this model, by the way. Circles are not necessarily circles. They tend to be a little bit contorted. So you're just going to have to sand those cylindrical pieces best you can so that the female side of things will fit around them properly. And I'm just wiping it so that I don't have any debris that could upset the bond between the two pieces when I glue it together. I'm going to put that little nacelle cap on, and it's going to spend the rest of the video staring at me mockingly, because even though I got it all aligned properly and straight with the vertical axis of the warp nacelle, it didn't quite fit all the way up to the end of the nacelle because there was too much plastic holding it back. So like I said, I did go back and fix it. So when you see the finished product of our build, you'll notice, if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, you'll notice that those nacelle end caps both fit quite nicely. But for the time being, it was good enough. And there you have it, a finished warp nacelle. There's a surprising amount of good detail molded into that little nacelle for 1987. So now we will just go ahead and start with the next one. And I'm just going to go back and repeat the process here, where I cut everything off the sprue with my snippers, and then sand some of the flashing down and do the assembly. Dry fitting. I don't always remember to dry fit, even though I stress it like a ton when I'm narrating these videos, because it is really important. It'll save you a lot of headaches. And I'm gonna demonstrate that point later on in the video in spectacular fashion. But I was happy with the fitment, so once again, we're going to do the glue. And as you can see, I tried to get a little bit smarter about how I was holding that piece in an attempt to not get quite so much glue on my fingers, so that I could avoid the same mess that I created with the other warp nacelle, because nobody likes making messes if they don't have to. And nobody likes cleaning up messes if they don't have to, right? Yep. So once again, I'm just going to smush those things together. I had some leftover residue on my fingers. I didn't like the feels, so I wiped my fingers. It's totally okay to take a break to wipe your hands if you get some junk on your hands you don't want there. Now I'm going to sand down those seam lines as best as I can to try to get them to sit as flush as possible. I'm also, in an exercise of futility, trying to pry some of that glue residue that I got on the nacelle off with my fingernail. That actually did end up working in the long run, so that's good to know. That particular brand of glue that I'm using, which I believe I got at Hobby Lobby, it's Mr. Glue or something like that. It'll as long as it hasn't cured, it'll pry off with a fingernail if needs be. I'm trying to get those contact points with the sprue sanded too. That's an area that we might find ourselves having to fill in the next video. It was hard to tell at that particular moment whether or not there was a little divot, but we may put a little filler just in case. But I'm just running my thumbnail along the seam line, and that's kind of how I gauge the fit. If I can run my thumb across it and it doesn't get caught up, then I know I've got a good seam, a good flush seam. But if it gets caught up on something, then I know I need to do a little bit more work to smooth that out. And if you're kind of lazy like I am, I'll tell you that 60 grit sandpaper will just get you everywhere you need to go. It's a coarse enough sandpaper that it can handle some relatively heavy loads, but it's a fine enough sandpaper that if you don't go back with a finer grit sandpaper after the fact and smooth things out even more, once you get the thing in primer and base coated, you're not going to tell you sanded. You're not going to be able to tell very well that you sanded anything, as long as you don't get too crazy with it. Just light sanding. Light sanding. Especially in areas like the Bussard collector here. Don't ever expect perfection out of the Bussard collectors on this kit, because for whatever reason, they're really strangely shaped and kind of bulbous and weird. And I'm sure there's a tool that could maybe help me get them looking a little bit more perfect, but I don't own it. So all I was really trying to do there was, get the seam lines under control, because that's all I figured I could do. I have neither the patience nor the experience to try to sand it into a perfect half sphere. And now I'm doing the thing that I recommend you do earlier. I am sanding that little cylindrical contact area to make sure that there's not too much material there to keep me from being able to put that end cap on properly. Sometimes you have to do dumb things in order to get smarter. That's definitely the case in modeling. Sometimes you make some mistakes, some boo-boos, and you go, well, that didn't work out very well. So you have to step back and you got to think about how you could do it better. And sometimes you do that and it's actually possible to, walk things back a bit and correct what you've done. And those moments are great. When we can actually go back and correct a boo-boo, that's wonderful. But if not, we just keep going. If you don't build it to your satisfaction the first time, get yourself another kit and try again. Don't let a little oopsie dissuade you or discourage you from, making progress and getting experience. Now you may be wondering what I'm doing here. I am using my hobby knife to cut the teeny tiny little nub that AMT calls the deflector dish antenna out of the deflector dish. And the reason being, it just doesn't look all that great. I mean, it's a teeny tiny little nub. It doesn't even reach the top point of the dish. It sits inside the dish. And if you watch the show, which I'm sure anybody who's watching this video probably has at least once, you would know that the antenna pokes out from the dish. So I'm going to kind of jury-rig everything a bit to make sure that I can get that particular look. I'd also like to take a moment to give props to whoever did my hair, because I was having a great hair day. I got it cut recently and I did some highlights because I wanted y'all to be able to stare at pretty hair when I got my head in frame, blocking my actions in building the models. So all I did here is I got a pin vise and I drilled a hole with a bit that was the same size as that thumbtack. And now I'm going to take my snippers. I'm going to chop off the business end of that thumbtack. I thought my little snippers would do it, but I ended up having to move to my bigger snippers because my little snippers couldn't quite get the torque I needed to cut through. I was afraid I might break something. A more ideal tool for this would be if you've got like wire strippers. They've got a little cutting mechanism on the back end of them, and those are pretty much designed for this kind of stuff. But I didn't measure because this isn't the first time I've done this. Now I'm going to use actual super glue. The glue that I use on the plastic pieces is just a plastic model glue, and it only works when there's contact between plastic and plastic. And obviously, since I'm using a metal piece off of a thumbtack, that's just not going to happen. So I'm using some actual super glue, some cyanoacrylate, to do this, and I'm also comically struggling with my tweezers, which I should have known beforehand were going to be a terrible idea. And here I am doing what I should have done to start with and saying, whatever, and using my fingers to drop that piece into place. And once I got that put together to my satisfaction, First I will show off my handiwork, but then we're pretty much just going to set that aside for now. For one thing, we got to let the glue cure, because we don't want to be working with that and accidentally knock that little piece of thumbtack off, kilter or whatever, after taking all that time to get it all straight and looking beautiful. So that really only leaves one more piece to get off the sprue besides the deflector dish, and that would be our deflector housing. We're gonna show you another close-up of that because I'm super proud of my handiwork. I'm also going to let you know that we do not want to remove that from the sprue right now. We're actually going to prime it before we remove it from the sprue. That way it doesn't get lost while we're working. And we're going to base coat the rest of the model, and then there's some detail we're going to paint on that deflector housing before we actually install the deflector dish. So that's why I'm holding it aside. We'll do that. We'll do that in the next one. Here I'm trying to build an altar to sandpaper. I kid. I want to try to sand that particular cylindrical area, contact area, down as straight as I possibly can. So what I'm doing here is I'm just building myself a little shelf, and then I can move that piece back and forth along my hobby pad there. And that's going to help me keep everything consistent when it comes to the angle at which I'm sanding it. I don't know why that was important at the time, but it seemed like something I should do. So I did, and now I'm just dry fitting yet again. And this part of the build did end up being a little frustrating because every time I get that thing on, all the extra plastic on that cylindrical contact area would just force it right off. That cylinder was not round, it was kind of oblong. Also, there are some panels that come off of each side of the deflector housing as well as the bottom that coincide with similar panels that look really nice on the show because they run into the rest of the engineering hull. I can tell you, having built this will be my third time building this kit, you are not going to get all of those lined up properly because the piece is just not molded that way. My suggestion in that regards is to get the bottom panels lined up and just accept that the side panels on the deflector housing are going to sit lower than the side panels on the engineering hull. And I really don't have a suggestion as to what you could possibly do in order to fix that. It just is, as I've already mentioned twice, if AMT is watching this is a kit that desperately needs a new tooling. But until then, just be aware that there are certain parts that aren't going to fit properly. Luckily, they're on areas of the ship that most people aren't going to see a whole lot of. So that's nice. It's not like your friends are going to walk in and be like, oh, look at that cool little ship you've got there, and then pick it up and start, examining it under a magnifying glass. That's probably not going to happen. Unless you run around with my crowd. My friends might do that just for kicks and giggles, but yours are probably nicer. So I still haven't gotten things as well sanded as I need them to be to get those parts to fit together properly. That's okay though. It's okay to take your time and really work at getting excuse me, at getting parts prepped before you put them together. In fact, I would say that's a great idea. Work meticulously to make sure that your parts are prepped before you glue them together. It's going to save you a huge headache. You're not going to have to pry pieces off and fix them and then glue them again because you will already have prepared them for being put together. And that's fantastic. And see here, I think I've got it done. And it made me so excited. But there's a little bit of a nub I left from the sprue where the piece was hanging onto the sprue. So I knew I needed to sand that down because even though it's on the bottom of the ship, I would know it's there and I would think it looks awful. And so here I am kind of just taking stock of where it's at right now. Truth be told, that panel, the panel as it sits on the engineering hull, also wasn't very wasn't very straight. It's a distinct possibility that my engineering hull that's supposed to be mostly cylindrical is actually more of an oval. I didn't want to take that close of a look because that's the kind of mistake on the manufacturer's part that would drive me crazy. So I'm just sanding things the best I can and trying my best to remain gleefully oblivious to any warts that this kit might contain at this point. Now I'm going to use a little bit of my muscle to really get that nub sanded down. And then I broke the thing off because it still wasn't sitting well. It still didn't quite fit. I'm not going to worry about sanding it. I mean, I was able to get it flush. I just needed to not fiddle with it. That was really what did that operation in. So now I'm looking at my nacelles, and now that that glue has had a chance to set pretty well, I'm just going to go back and file my sprue nubs off the end caps there, try to get them roughly the same shape and size as the rest of the nacelles. Again, just go slowly. You can always take more material off the model if you need to, but you can't, well, I guess you can, to a degree, put material back on. It's just a lot more work than what you probably really need to be doing. But now I'm going to work my way around with my eye, just looking at the various parts of the nacelle. And I'm just going to go ahead and, in general, clean things up. Get any excess flash that might be attached to some of those pieces if I missed it. Just do a final check over to make sure that things look as good as I can get them. This is model building. It's tedious, time consuming, but it's pretty fun. We'll give it a thumbs up. So now I've got essentially 4 sub-assemblies. So now what I'm going to do with those 4 sub-assemblies is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to start cleaning them up as much as I can to get them ready to put together. I'm still trying to work on that uneven part of the bottom of the engineering hull where that panel dovetails into it. I wasn't able to get it perfect because it ended up being kind of crooked, but I got it as good as I could get it. And again, perfect is the enemy of progress. So get things as good as you can. Get them looking good to your eye, and really that's all that matters. Now I'm just inspecting close to make sure there aren't any other glaring problems with that particular area. Where the nacelle pylons sandwiched in there, there is quite a noticeable gap. That's kind of a surprise to me because, like I said earlier, usually I have the opposite problem where that area between the two pylons tends to bulge out from the rest of the model. But here there actually was a pretty decent fit, except that there was just a little bit of a gap in that area. And there's a little gap between the nacelles and the engineering hull there at the bottom. So I'm going to use my Tamiya white plastic putty to fill those, and once it gets all dried and cured, then I should be able to go ahead and sand it, and when it's all primed and painted, you shouldn't be able to tell that there was ever anything there, if I do my job well. So I'm just using the ball end of my putty knife here to press that filler into those crevices and really make sure that everything gets filled up. That way when I sand it, I get a nice smooth finish. I don't have to worry about there being any gaps or bubble areas or whatever. One of these days, I will figure out how to keep my work in frame for the entire video for you guys. But that's one of those things that takes practice. Now I'm just trying to scrape off some of the excess. It's going to just make my cleanup a little easier, and why leave a little excess when there's something else you can fill? That looks good enough to me. Now I'm just going to wipe my filler off of my knife. And then we're going to move along. And as far as getting these sub-assemblies together, I like to start by putting the saucer on the engineering hull. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with the saucer here. I'm just going to take my 60 grit and sand around the saucer to even up the lines between those two pieces and try to get them sitting as flush to one another as I can get them. I'm also secretly trying to impose the proper angle of the hull along the edge of the saucer here. When you put these pieces together, I don't know how to explain it, but they kind of just go, straight up and down, perpendicular to the horizontal axis of the saucer itself. And if you look at reference material, you can quite clearly see that that's not the angle that edge of the saucer is supposed to be at. So just trying to work a bit of that angle in there and try to make it just a teeny bit more accurate in that little way. It's not anything to obsess over, but if you're thinking about it, it's worth giving it a try. I'm just methodically working my way around, and I am sanding against the seam. In my experience, that's been the best way to get the seams to get flush. If you suffer from motion sickness, I highly recommend you look away, because apparently I was getting a little into it with that sandpaper. It was causing my camera arm to shake around. I can't say as I've ever had that problem before. And I'll go for one more pass around the edge of the saucer there. Again, you really can't over prepare pieces when it comes to getting them ready for assembly and whatnot. So just take your time and be as anal retentive as you need to be in order to get the job done to your satisfaction. Now I'm just feeling around with my thumb. There's a seam line there that I don't like. You can see how I can pull on the pieces with my thumb. And that means we've got quite a seam line still left there. So I'm just gonna maybe get a teeny bit more aggressive with my sandpaper. Try to get that worked out. Now obviously you don't want to go too crazy with that sandpaper, because if you get too crazy, you might sand the saucer so much that it winds up not being circular, and that could look a little goofy if all of a sudden your saucer section looks like an oblong mess. So just take your time. Like I said, just take a little bit at a time. That way you're not going to deform anything in the process of trying to make it look better. Pretty sure the Germans have a word for that, fixing something until it's broken. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want to fix things till they break. That just makes more unnecessary work for us, and it can take a little fun out of the experience. And at the end of the day, the ultimate point of a hobby like scale modeling is to have fun. I'm just going to work my way around. I was looking very critically at this model as I was doing this sanding. I wanted to try to make sure that every detail that I could get just right, I got just right. I had a desire at the time to do the OG Enterprise proper justice in my build. I'll probably end up filling that seam with some putty when we get to the filling and sanding part, but that's good for now. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start looking at what needs to happen to get the saucer glued onto that neck. And I've got a little experience from the past in building this, so I didn't feel too concerned about just going ahead and gluing it on. I had actually checked the fit a little earlier to make sure that everything was going to fit okay, because sometimes when the molds are a little wacky, those vertical fins at the top of the neck that offer more contact area can be a little too tall. So I made sure that those weren't going to be a problem, and then just dove right in. I recommend dry fitting it before you put it on there, though. You don't want your saucer sitting too tall or too far off the neck to look believable to the eye. And now I'm just obsessively checking to make sure that the neck is perpendicular to the saucer. Try to make sure that my alignment is as accurate as I can get it. I'm just making little tweak adjustments here and there. You can kind of see under my lights the reason why I don't like the fact that AMT put those copyright blurbs on the top of the saucer, because you can kind of see it through the plastic there. I mean, obviously I've got really bright lights on me from pretty much every direction you can fathom, but if you weren't planning to paint this, that could end up being a bit of an eyesore. So I'm about to give 50 imaginary points to anybody who catches what I did wrong here. Put your answer in the comments, and we'll see if anybody catches it. All right, you good? Cool. So I just went ahead. I was chugging along. I did dry fit that nacelle to make sure that it would go on properly. But then I just went ahead and glued it on there. And one of the reasons why I did that is because I have a terrible memory, and it's been probably over a decade since I built this kit. And so I forgot some of the tricks that I had figured out to make this build a little easier. But it's also a really good opportunity to teach you guys a little something at my expense. As you can tell already, that nacelle is not very well aligned. I'm not very happy with it. I'm going to fiddle with it for pretty much the rest of the episode. I apologize in advance. But once I put that glue on, it sets so quickly that if I've got, seconds to try to get things aligned, and unfortunately it takes a little longer than that to align things when it comes to these nacelles. So I goofed up a bit, but that's okay. We're just going to move along. We will try to fix it best we can. If push really came to shove, I could just have used some of my Uncure, which is wonderful. Highly recommend having some of that. And I could have just used the Uncure to pull it apart and start over. But this practice of not dry fitting and just gluing things willy-nilly is about to come back to bite me in the rear end pretty hard. You can see I'm struggling to get that piece on. I think the clip that's supposed to clip inside the nacelle was just too big, like it was a bit deformed. So now I'm getting all kinds of violent with it, and oh no, I broke it. What will I do now? Fortunately, there is still enough of that clip left that once I put the glue on, it held fine. It'll work. Nobody's going to know once it's sitting on a shelf, right? But here we are. It's a great object lesson in test fitting your pieces, but also being patient and not trying to force things. And also, in hindsight, I had to relearn something that I probably learned about a decade ago with this little kit. That you put the nacelles on dry, and then you can get them adjusted to make sure that they're straight and aligned. And once you get them in that position, then you put the glue on. And so that way, you don't have to contend with cured glue in order to get your nacelles aligned the way that you want them to be aligned. Look at that. My little enterprise looks like a parallelogram. That is terrible. So how are we going to fix that now that those things are glued in place, you might ask? Let me introduce you to my friend, the heat gun. He is good. This is not recommended unless it's absolutely necessary. It's one of those kind of last-ditch nuclear efforts. But if you have some parts that you've already glued together that aren't fitting properly, or they're not aligned properly, then you can hit it with the heat from a heat gun for a little bit, and that'll soften the plastic up, and it'll allow you, as you can see, to manipulate that piece just a tiny bit. You can't overdo it, because if you overdo it, you're going to break it. But just a little bit, and you want to be real gentle. We're talking Bob Ross putting snow on mountains gentle. You just want that the way he wanted that paint knife to just kind of skim and skip over the surface of the canvas. You just want to gently, almost without any pressure, move that thing. Because again, if you get too violent with it, you're going to break it, and it's going to turn out bad. So now I'm going to hit that other side, and yeah, we're gonna be spending about the next 4 minutes or so just trying to get these nacelles aligned. And it really is a lot harder after you've got everything glued in place. So I really don't recommend getting yourself to this position in life, because once you get here, it is kind of hard to come back. Make sure you properly fit things, and some people use Legos to build like little jigs that they can set their models into that'll help square everything up. I did not have that option because I do not have spare Legos, but I've seen it done, and I hear that it is quite nice. And if you want to get creative and try building a jig to square up your pieces, I think that's a wonderful idea. It will probably save you a lot of headache if you can get it engineered properly. I don't think I ever really got the plastic on that port nacelle as soft as I needed in order to get the results that I wanted. But as I massaged a little here and a little there, I did finally get things to a point where I was pretty happy with it. We're trying to make these things as accurate and detailed as possible, but at the end of the day, all that really matters is that they pass the 2-foot test, which is, how good do they look sitting 2 feet from you? I don't believe that these are the kinds of models. I mean, unless you've got some serious OCD, I don't believe that these are the kind of models that you're going to build up and take to a model show or competition and be winning too many awards with. They're really not designed for that. These are designed to be more of a casual experience where you just build it for yourself or build it for a friend or whatever and get some practice out of it and just have a nice, relaxing, enjoyable experience for the most part, as long as you don't do, silly things like I did. Another area of alignment to be aware of as you're trying to get all of these nacelles aligned and whatnot is the vertical axis of the nacelles themselves. You can see I kind of stumbled into success there. My nacelles, at least from a vertical point of view, are in pretty good shape. But if you're trying for perfection or close to it, make sure you're paying attention to how the nacelles are sitting vertically. And yeah, sometimes it's necessary to manipulate things from multiple directions at one time in order to get the results you're looking for. That's just how it goes sometimes. Now the good thing is, if you goof this one, it's been released so many times that it's not too hard to find sets that have this kit. We've gone over all of them. I don't know about that TOS set that comes with the Romulan Bird of Prey and the Klingon D7. I know that the Cadet Series set is a little bit on the pricier side these days, but with that new set coming out this month, that will hopefully drive some of those prices a little bit lower. And so you can definitely get sets that have this kit for a pretty reasonable price. Now I'm just making sure that vertically my nacelles look pretty good, and as you can see, I've given it my thumbs up of approval. That's going to do it for this one, guys. I appreciate you watching. Please Please like and subscribe, and until next time, happy modeling.